Today we're doing a little bit different topic that we haven't done before, or we've done it once before, but it's not a topic that we've covered so much. So this is really exciting as well to cover something very new. So we're going to be talking about PR tactics and how to get through when you're not really known in the field yet. Before we get started, I just want to spend 5 minutes introducing Pre-Seed Academy, because we have about 60 new people here. So welcome to all of you. I'm just going to do a speed intro on the Academy, as I always do. And then after that, we'll jump right into it with Alice, who is going to talk about her experiences here at Pre-Seed Ventures, about how she works with the startups and her best advice on how to go about it when you maybe don't have a lot of experience yourself and need to get started. And then after Alice, we're going to say hi to Robin. Robin is the co-founder of Coco and has also a lot of experience from previous startups and other companies he has worked at. And he's going to give you this founder story about or his experiences on how to go about this this area. And then in the end, about 9:45, we are going to do the live Q&A. And that I will facilitate this Q&A where you can ask us questions. You can ask the questions as we go along, or you can wait until the end. And I'm just gonna I'll get back to that in just in a few minutes on how we go about that Q&A. So just a speed intro to the Academy. We've been around since 2018, and it started as a thought leadership initiative that we have as investors a lot of knowledge from all the startups that we work with, and we thought that we wanted to share this with in a more broader sense. And so we started hosting events where we invited other founders primarily of our portfolio to talk about different aspects of startup life, different challenges that you might face when you start your tech startup. So that's kind of the beginning of it. And today we're a little bit we've grown as well. So actually it was Alice who started the Academy, and she used to be in my position before. So some of you who have been along for a while, you might recognize Alice from the time before Corona, where you could meet up with her. So today I'm the program manager, and we are not only hosting events, we're also doing feedback sessions, open door sessions. We built a bigger platform last year where we are just pouring all this content into the platform, so that no matter where you are in your journey, you can actually go explore and you can see all the previous startup talks and tool talks, and everything that we have done will be uploaded onto this platform. But I mean, we only know so much as investors, but I think what is really unique about this Academy is that we are not like an academic program. We are actually built on the foundation of these founders. So every time we have a startup talk or a tool talk, we invite founders in to actually tell their story and their experiences, and you get to talk with them and ask them questions like Robin is here today. So I think that is really a strength of our Academy, that it's very hands-on and it's very with our founders who have walked the path before you. Yeah, so here's something we call the roadmap. And if you are new to the Academy, this is everything that we have done so far, and it's quite a lot, as you see. And we are uploading this onto our platform at psvacademy.dk. Where you can find these things both as recordings, but you can also find digests, you can find tools, you can find a lot of great things in there, and see who were previous speakers and all these things. And of course, also our program ahead. So today we are here on the go-to-market road metro line. We've done quite a few of them, but it's also a subject that's really important. And we have a few startup talks already planned, but that will be after the summer. So the next one will be a legal topic with my colleague Jonathan, who will be talking about shareholders agreements. And then we have another one planned out about user feedback. I haven't uploaded that yet. I'm working on it, but it will be uploaded very soon. So check out our program on our website. There's going to be a lot of great stuff ahead, and also there's lots of content you can already explore. Yeah, so then we kind of call it our pool, and you can go explore all these things on our website. So back to the Q&A thing. At the bottom of your screen, you have a toolbar where it says Q&A. So when you ask the questions, please use the Q&A function and not the chat, because that way I can see the questions in a more structured way, and I can also, check off when we answered them and all these things. You can also upvote your favorite questions. So please have a look at the questions already there. If there's something that's very alike that you want to ask anyway, then just upvote your questions, because that way I know which ones to prioritize when we get there. And as I said, you can do it as we go along, or you can do it in the end. It doesn't matter. If you're still, after this Q&A, still left with a lot of questions, or if you need feedback on something, then we have open door sessions, which are 30 minutes of one-to-one feedback with one of our investment managers. The next one will be in September 1st. There's quite a while for it, but that's going to be the next one. You can go ahead and apply for that, and then if you're picked out, we handpick who get to meet with us. Then you can speak with one of our investment managers. And this startup talk is being recorded, and I will upload it on our website after, maybe tonight or tomorrow. And I will also send you the slides and some key takeaways on an email. If there are any links or something that are mentioned, or things that are mentioned during the startup talk, then I will include that in the email, so that you don't have to do anything but to focus on what these guys are saying. So with that said, I think, we have the open door. With that said, I think we should jump right into it and give the word to Alice.
I'm just going to share my screen before we get started.
Yes, do that.
1 second. Here we go. Can you guys see my screen now? Perfect. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Really nice to not see you, but I'm really happy that you are joining in today. I'm Alice, as Louisa just said. I'm head of communications and community at Pre-Seed Ventures. I'll get back to that in a minute. Today, we're going to talk about PR strategy and how to create your PR story as a startup. So this is not a general talk. There will be some things that are general to any kind of PR strategy, but I tried to shape this around my experience with working with startups. The good news from my experience is that being a founder is the perfect training for doing PR. You pitch your story all the time. I don't have to tell you, you probably know that you're doing that all the time. You are used to rejections, not least in funding. And if you aren't yet, then you have to become used to it when you do PR, because you won't get through with your story every time. You always need to know your audience and understand what kind of investor or what kind of customer you're sitting in front of. And then finally, as a founder, you already chose to take an unbeaten path as a career choice. So you already have a unique story to tell in your own person. Unfortunately, there's also a challenge. In my experience, what I often see is that it's really hard for you as a founder to translate. You're so used to talking about your metrics, your CAC, your ROI, all kinds of things, and your tech and what your AI can do and stuff like that, that it can be hard to translate into a story that works in a PR context or press context, more exactly. So my biggest goal today is if I can just give you a little bit of a better understanding about what the story is when you do PR and not a sales pitch or an investor pitch. A little bit about me before I get to it, so you know why I'm talking about this topic today. I won't get into the details of what I've done before, but I can say that from very early on, I thought I was going to work in advertising and in agencies. So I did a what is that called? A bachelor in business administration and organizational communication. Then I found out that I thought it was not creative enough, and I really liked to work with how to create creative environments and how to do innovation. So I did a master in organizational entrepreneurship. Did anyone say something? No? Okay. And then I had a career trying the life as a founder myself, and found out that I still thought the most fun part was to work with the brand and tell the stories of the companies I was creating. So I thought I wanted to get a little bit back to that. It ended up at Pre-Seed Ventures, where I work with all our own communication and our brand, but I also work with a huge portfolio of great founders and support them in doing their PR and how they shape their strategic narratives of the companies. You can see a few of the companies in our portfolio that I worked with. One of them very recently is Coco. So I'm really happy that Robin decided to join us today and share his experiences, because we had a really good process with doing their PR, and he's been super structured with working on their PR initiatives. So I'm really happy that you get to hear his experiences later on. We'll see if I get through all of these 3 points. The most important thing is that I get through the first one. I tend to speak a lot, but I am gonna try to keep it short if I can. So we're gonna begin with why good PR doesn't begin with your funding necessarily. Then I'm gonna go through a few basics around PR that is really good to know beforehand. And in the end, I'm going to cover some places I find very good resources for PR, and where in general you should go for getting help on PR. So let's get right to it. Funding isn't your story or your PR strategy. When you get your first funding, it can be a really good trigger event for starting to do funding, because it gives you a news value and it gives you a story. Yeah, it creates the news value that is a good trigger event for actually doing a PR story. But often I find that when I meet founders, they say, well, we raised this much money and that's our story. The point is that you don't really get to tell any, you don't have a strategic goal with telling your funding story. It becomes a story about funding, and then what, you made a splash around your funding, but maybe you didn't get the strategic messages you wanted around your company through with your story. And also you can start earlier. You can actually start to build your PR relationships before funding. There are some very good examples of startups and founders who have leveraged their story even before getting funding, or never shaped their narrative around funding. One of the very great examples that many of you probably know, because she's often in the media, is Frederikke from Rockamore. I've just picked a few examples of the stories she's told from the very beginning, but also more recently. And if you notice, she hasn't got a lot of venture stories where she says, I raised a Series A of this much money, or I got this very cool investor on board. Instead, she's been telling stories about her own journey, or also telling a lot about being a female entrepreneur, for example. Then you could say, well, is that a story I want to tell if you're sitting out there and is a female entrepreneur, or can say something about diversity? But I think the important thing is to see here is that it's a really good strategy for Frederikke, because her target group, her customers, is actually business women. So speaking about female entrepreneurs and doing stories around that actually speaks to her target group. So it's not just a way of her being heard. There's actually some very good points in choosing to shape that narrative and speak to that agenda. And that takes me right back to one of my, this is a point I get back to all the time. Let the strategic narrative of your business drive your PR, not the other way around. So figure out what is your core narrative of the story. You don't have to have a 10-page communication strategy or a long sort of brand presentation where you have all the elements of your story, but find your why and find out just a few value-driven messages that is the core of what you want to say about your company, and let that drive the PR you're doing. Don't let your ego or vanity metrics get the best of you in doing PR. It's easy to be sort of captivated by the idea of getting your name out in TechCrunch, or for a Danish context in Børsen. But if you don't have a clear strategic purpose for doing it, maybe you actually need to think about something else and be in other types of media. So let the right purposes and the right goals drive you, not any kind of more egocentric purposes. Sorry, there was a mistake. And then tie it in with your business milestones. Sit down and think about, okay, what are we gonna accomplish in the next 3 to 6 months, or maybe even longer? How long is our runway? Are we having any upcoming product launches? Do we need to recruit 25 people? What is your milestones? And what is our strategic purpose? And then tie your PR strategy in with that. Create your story around it, and so on and so forth. Finally, think ahead. So think, that's a bit tied in with the business milestones, but also when you do PR very early, make sure you think ahead. If you create a very defined story around where you are right now, what can your product do right now, something other topics related to your current situation, you might end up doing PR 6 months or 12 months down the road, but then you pivoted your business or changed your brand, or there will definitely be pivots and changes. So tie your story in with your long-term vision. You might change that a little bit, but I rarely experience that the long-term vision and the bigger purpose of things changes radically. So if you speak to the bigger vision, there's a much greater chance that you can leverage the first stories you make and don't have to start all over with the next PR initiative you do. I've decided to have Amanda Gorman on this photo for a reason, not just because she's an amazing storyteller and she did a great job when she probably blew the mind of many of us, but because it was actually also a clever choice from Biden. He was creating a context that was super relevant to a lot of people, so he knew he was speaking to both a diversity agenda around Black Lives Matters and a Me Too debate and a female debate, and also speaking to some strategic visions he had for his politics going forward. So he was both speaking to his own strategic priorities, and he was speaking to a context that he knew would a lot of people would relate to and find relevant. So there was many reasons for that being a great example of a strategic choice and narrative he created there. Find your position with your PR. I'm not going to talk that much about this model, but more give you examples. But the point is that actually the classic narrative of a fairy tale, you can use that as a way of thinking around, okay, what role am I gonna take in my PR, and be sort of coherent in the role you build. Luna is an amazing example of someone who has done that very clever and have done it all the way. You see it in their branding and marketing, in their campaigns, that they are working with young influencers. They're doing campaigns on TikTok. So they're doing sort of rebel things in a very established industry, but you also see it in the PR. So there's a very coherent narrative that they're building. Every time there's a tendency in the market where interest rates go up, they lower their interest rates, and that gives them PR, because then they go out and say, we are going to challenge the established industry, or this tendency in the established industry is wrong and we are doing it differently, or even creating a PR story around their TikTok strategy, creating a feature around cleaning the oceans, talking about stress for entrepreneurs, things that are not necessarily the most common story around a bank, but that gives them exactly that challenger role in everything they do, that they need to show that they are a different kind of bank. Another good example is Radiobotics. They've been very good at their PR, and they've done it very early on. So in general, if you need inspiration for who is doing PR and have done it very early on, just research their stories, research what they've done, and use it as inspiration. But what they have spoken a lot about is they both did opinion pieces, stories, and also in their they've been creating a narrative where they put themselves very close to public institutions, which, for example, with their funding, they raised 2 million euros from public funds from EU. They also got on the financial law in Denmark and got funding there. And it all gives them that credibility they need because they're working in healthcare. They're going to create a very new service for hospitals. They need hospitals to trust them. So this gives them the credibility they need, but also they pinpoint things that are wrong in the industry in terms of creating innovation and get to tell how they can actually be part of changing our welfare state in general. So I think it's a very smart way of taking a specific position and being the innovator in a business, but also creating credibility in being that, not just being a small startup that people don't trust. So what's the story, Morning Glory? And that's not the Oasis song, I mean, but that the news are news. They are telling what is new this morning. And they wanted to, and you need to think about that and understand that when you create your specific PR story, not your strategic narrative. You need to understand why your story is new and relevant. Sorry, I don't know what happened here. And tie it in. So you need to create relevance and tie it in with a current context. So a journalist is going to see how this has a bigger audience than just a few customers in your company or investors. You could think about how you tie in with bigger societal trends. Maybe you have some big clients or customers early on that have a bigger name than yours. Then use your case and customer stories to tell your own story through them. Use your personal story. If you're, for example, doing a lot of recruiting, maybe it's actually a good idea to tell your personal story as an entrepreneur about your leadership style, about going from being a school teacher to a tech entrepreneur, what it could be that would show candidates you want to speak to why they should work for you. Thought leadership and an unusual story. Are you doing something very unusual? Apso, our portfolio company, is a great example of this. They do AI, but they've actually also told quite a few stories around how they have a very flat hierarchy and how everyone has the same salary and how they have a specific philosophy around this, which is more about their company and doing something that is completely out of the ordinary. Create reports, data, insight. Can you say something with the data you have, or make a report with a partnership in a partnership with someone where you can actually say something clever about tendencies that you see or some knowledge that you have a unique position in. Then I've written this disruption. You have to be careful with that because everyone in startup thinks that they're disrupting an industry, which you are. But that means that you have to, if you speak about disruption, you have to be really able to say that there's a huge transformation of an industry. If you're creating just a generic story around we are going to revolutionize this industry, then you're not creating a very unique story. A good example is Seaborg, who is doing a new kind of nuclear power. Obviously, that's a story you can leverage when you take a topic that is so radical as nuclear power and saying that this is going to change our climate. Remember, I'm just going to say this quick. Remember, your PR is not a marketing text. It's not an investor pitch. It's not tech specific, and it's not an about text of your company. So forget about we convert this many customers for, we change the conversion rate so and so much for our customers. It's not relevant for a journalist unless you can really tie it in with some of the examples I gave above. Find your inner clickbaiter is my best advice. You don't have to create a tabloid story, but try to have your story and then write a headline for it and imagine that headline on a newspaper or on an online media site, and think about, okay, can I imagine people who doesn't know my company would click on this headline? Maybe test it on people who are not too close to your company. Would you click on this headline if you saw it on a media site? So try to get into that mindset, because that's how a journalist is going to think. Okay, I think I'm running out of time, but we'll see how far we get. The vital basics of PR. I'll just go through a few things that is really good to know.
Alice, I don't think we have time for it because it's already 25 and we need to get Robin on stage. But
can I just take the last things?
What?
I'll just take the few last slides. Is that okay? That takes 1 minute.
Absolutely. I just wanted to
getting help.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to everybody out there that Alice and I were just talking about before, to get these slides that we're not covering now. We're just going to wrap them up and with a few notes so that you're not missing out on all the content. So we'll upload that either on our website or send it to you in an email with a few explanations of the things that we didn't get to cover. So sorry, Alice.
More basics that are very good to know. Thinking about exclusivity, what is a wide press release, stuff like that. And I will explain that in text. It's not, you won't miss out on anything. Robin will also cover a lot of these things with his examples. I quickly want to touch on where you get external help and if you should so at all, because I know it's a question often. Should I hire a PR agency? And is it too early for me to hire a PR agency? I would say always try to do your PR yourself once or twice or three, even more if it works out for you. It's really expensive to get an agency on board. And the value you get out of getting an agency on board later, if you try to do it yourself, is much bigger, because you will know much more about doing PR, so you can manage the PR agency way better. So wait, don't do it too early. It's too expensive, but you can get freelancers in. For example, work with copywriters, get a proofreader if you're doing international PR and you're a Danish speaking person, or get an external communication or PR freelancer on board on a frequent basis. If you have a very junior hire in communication, it can be a great help to work with a freelancer who is sort of your sparring partner on strategy, and then you have a more junior hire to execute on it. Remember to ask for references in your network before you hire anyone. What should you expect from an investor? It's more to cover, because if you have investors on board or get investors on board, you can actually ask them for help. Not everyone does it, so it depends. I can't say they do or they do not. I can say that for our part, what I do is I help shape and scope the strategy and story for our startups. Then I guide founders through their own process. So they do the press releases and get the story and CTA defined, but I give feedback and I help. I also help pitching to journalists, or help with getting the right context if people want to try out pitching themselves. And then in the longer run, I'm an available sparring partner on branding, potential PR stories, contacts, or especially suggestions for agencies. For some investors, they will only help around the funding release and then don't have a service for later on. So it depends, but make sure you ask your investor at least for recommendations on agencies, because they will know who have successfully worked with someone in their portfolio, and it's not all PR agencies who know the game of working with startups. And then this will be sent out. It's the best resources I know for working with PR. I would highly recommend to listen to the podcasts and read the blog posts before you get started. That was it. Sorry, Louise, if we're taking.
No, it's okay. Thank you. And you know, I sometimes think, you know, that this 1 hour is too short because we have so many things to cover. But then in the end, it's always also great just to keep it for 1 hour. So it's a balance. So, Robin, I think you're up.
Awesome.
And Alice.
Thanks a lot, Alice.
Yes.
Alice.
Thank you.
Let me just share my screen as well. And you can see, I guess, super nice to be here. I can recommend the open door. We did it last summer and got great advice from Helle, so much recommended. But yeah, I'm Robin, the co-founder and CEO of Kogo, and I was thinking I was going to give you a quick background on Kogo and me, and then I'm going to go through the steps that I take when I take a press release or write a press release, and then a bit on the preparations I do before I start the actual pitching the story to the journalists, and then finally how I actually do the pitching when I'm actually talking to the journalists. So at Kogo, we're passionate to gather shared rides for frictionless mobility and a better tomorrow. And maybe you don't know, but there are hundreds of shared mobility operators in Europe, and it is a very complex market. So Kogo basically show all electric scooters, cars, bikes, and mopeds from 190 operators, I think we have now, in 500 cities. So we just want to make it super easy to move around, so you only have to check in one place. Before Kogo, I worked at Momondo as the regional director, and there I was the first PR certified country manager back when there was 20 people or so very early on. And I've also started and worked at a couple of other startups, and most recently I was part of Unity Electric Car as the CMO, and we had over 6,000 PR mentions there, so it was a lot of work around that. But now we're going to talk about PR, and maybe I mentioned it, but I'm going to be pretty practical and almost step by step. So hopefully you can learn a thing or two. But before you start actually writing the press releases, it is very important to know why you do the PR. Like, what is it that you want to get out of it? And PR is, of course, considered a brand awareness tool, but brand awareness to who? Is it for the users, investors, potential partners, or maybe employees? So, and these are very different stories. So think about what kind of stories you want to put out there. And to help you figure this out, you can define your strategic pillars, and they work as a guide to make sure that your PR efforts fulfills one or maybe several of the goals that you set out. So it's not just about spamming to get the word out there, but it should really have a purpose, and it should, of course, be aligned with your overall strategic goals to have a meaningful impact. And at Kogo now, currently, we want to establish trust among our partners. So that could be operators, or cities, or corporations. Because as a new startup, it is so important to show that we're legit and that people believe in us. And I'm going to give a lot of examples, but last week I talked to a local mobility operator in Sweden, and they actually already knew about me and Kogo because he read about us in the news, and he was super excited that we reached out to him actually. So it was very easy to start the conversation and doing business with him. So we already now started to implement him into our app. Second one is to get users to the app. So they read about us in the news and then they download our app basically. And the first press release we did in October last year increased our weekly download numbers by 3 times. So very big impact. And then the third one is that we want to show both our current but also new investors that we generate interest. So we want to create that FOMO for future funding rounds. And then once you have the strategic pillars in place, you can start crafting stories around this. And there are many different types of stories, of course, so it's important to know what you want to share and how those help and tie into the strategic pillar. So that could be a product announcement, the investment, or maybe a data-driven story of some sort. And this will also decide, like the type of story will also decide what kind of media or journalists you're actually gonna contact later. And then the timing is also super important. And for example, we waited almost 3 months with announcing our investment round before we had our new and improved app out. So that's also worth considering. And then it's important to, this is super important to make it relevant. And I usually believe this is the greatest news and it's such a big accomplishment by the team, right? But journalists or their readers, they might not think so. So it's important to really angle it in a way so that people care and find it interesting. And this is often called the hook. So try and tap into the news agendas or consider the bigger picture when you're crafting your stories. And so we had an investment release a couple of months ago where we utilized the fact that the team behind Kogo comes from Momondo. And as Momondo has been a very big success with a similar business model, journalists have been very keen to make that comparison and actually write about us. So while we wanted to get out that we raised capital and we're growing, the main story was focused on that this former Momondo team has now started a new Momondo for shared mobility. And then you should add credibility. And I think that most press releases should be backed up by data or other sources for support. And for young companies like ours, it's especially important. It simply adds credibility to what you're saying. You can also have quotes from thought leaders or relevant people in your industry for even more credibility. And we used a number of these. And again, in the last one, we had Alexander from Pre-Seed motivated or talked about why they decided to invest. We had a quote from Momondo's former CEO, Pia, who also invested and why she's excited to work with this team again. And then we used a lot of relevant data, for example, data that shows that half of all car trips are less than 5 kilometers, which could theoretically be replaced by bike. So things like that. And then the last step is, once you have your first draft that you've hopefully done yourself, it's great to get feedback from people in your network. And I used Alice a lot. Because if you ask for help, you often get it. So, and here it's of course possible to use freelancers or agencies, but like she just mentioned, they are pretty expensive in the beginning. And it's also important to get your words on it, because it's also, you know, the story you want to tell, and an external person doesn't know that. Then I basically fine tune the text and I go through the loop a couple of times until I'm satisfied. I'm not sure exactly how much time I spend on this, but a first draft could take a couple of days, and then you know, the rework and you know, how much it is depends on how good the first draft was and so on, and how much feedback. But it could that I spend like a full week on it all in all, but it could also be more. And then it's almost time to start pitching. But first, you need to understand the journalist landscape, and you really want to identify which journalists write about your industry, and you want to start building your own kind of journalist database. And this requires quite some work, either to Google or you search in the archives of the newspapers of previous articles to see who's writing about what. But by Googling different players in your industry or competitors with the newspaper's name, I usually get pretty quick results. So, I mean, for me, I could Google Donkey Republic and Börsen, for instance, to figure out who at Börsen is writing about Donkey Republic. And then I keep track of all of my different outlets by countries and who the journalists are and what they have written about before. And I also keep a lot of notes on what they've told me, if they said no or yes. So if they've written a story about us before, I remember that for the next time I wanna talk to them. And there are a lot of tools and systems out there to keeping such information. I used Meltwater before, but they tend to be pretty expensive. So I'm actually just using Google Sheets for all my notes and information, as you can see here. And then you have the understanding of the landscape. So now you have hopefully a long list of journalists, and so now it's the time to kind of decide who you should pitch for this specific release. And that of course depends on the story you have. So some of the criteria that I use are what kind of story is this? So it kind of helps me to identify who I should pitch to based on what they've written about before, and if my story has a similar theme. So a finance story is very relevant to outlets such as Börsen, but maybe not as much to a daily newspaper. So, I mean, it could be, I guess, but you should probably tweak the story slightly with another hook or angle to make it a bit more relevant. And then I look at the newspaper's reach, so how many people actually read it, and what's the focus of the newspaper. And niche outlets are normally smaller, but could have much more valuable readers actually. And we had a release in Die Digital in Sweden, and they had a much bigger impact on our app downloads than Dagens Industri, which is the Börsen of Sweden, even though Die Digital has many fewer readers. So that was very interesting. And then once I have my full list of journalists, I basically prioritize them from first to last in the order I want to pitch to them. And then I'll use that when I start the outreach, but I'll just cover that in a moment. And then finally, it's about building relationships. And this is of course ongoing all the time. But to be successful with PR, it is so important to know what the journalists care about. So I try to be as relevant as possible, and I try to avoid spamming the journalists because they probably get hundreds of emails per day. And if I just keep sending them crap in their eyes, they're gonna stop reading my emails. So, I mean, at least I would do that if someone was spamming me. So be clear to the point on the value that you can bring to them. And that means what kind of stories can you provide? So you wanna make their life easy. And after talking to them a couple of times, you're hopefully top of mind, and they'll think about you the next time they need a story instead of your competitor. And so you want to become the guy or girl that they call when they need something. And this also happened to us a few weeks ago when I talked to a journalist here in Denmark about an event we're attending, and then she was also writing an article that will be published in Germany. So she needed an example of an innovative mobility solution in Copenhagen. And just because I talked to her the day before, she asked if she could use Kogo as an example. So thanks to that, we'll now get our first media mention in Germany, which is of course great. And another thing to make it much easier, both for you, but also for the journalist, is to have a press kit ready. And that's basically a folder with company logos, some pictures of the spokespeople or the founders, and your previous press releases, anything that the journalist might need. So it just helps a lot to have this in place. You can quickly send them photos when they ask for it. And I just have a simple press page on our website, and then I link to a Google Drive where I can download the assets. And again, there are softwares and tools out there. I think my news desk is one of them. But again, it's free and it works, so why not? And now it's time to start pitching. And when I'm about to start pitching, I'll go back to my priority list and from the top to the bottom. And then it's always great to be able to offer the journalist exclusivity because they really like to break the news. So this means that I won't send the release to all of the journalists on the list at once, but I'd rather start from the top and then just take them one by one until one of them agrees to publish. So this might take some time, and you also got to give them some time to reply, maybe 1 or 2 days or something. So if you can, plan accordingly, and if possible, try and accommodate to their schedule to get the most out of it. I try to have like 1 or 2 weeks before the deadline to give myself time, but if you can have more, I'd say that's great. Because the journalist also might want to have an interview and ask follow-up questions to write a really good story. So it's not just that you send it out and it's done. It's a lot of work after that. And with one release, we sent it out at the same time in both Sweden and Denmark, and we ended up publishing in Sweden 2 weeks earlier. because the journalist here in Denmark was simply not possible to fit in his schedule the week I was pitching. But he asked if I could wait, and we got a full page story in person in this case as a result. So if I couldn't have waited that time, we would never receive that full page story in person. So if you can, take your time. And then once I've successfully pitched, so I have one exclusive story, so I'll lock that one in. I hold off the wider release until the same morning or the moment the exclusive article breaks. So when it's published on the website or in the newspaper. And with the wider release, which now Alice didn't really have time to mention it, but that's when you kind of, first you pitch exclusive one journalist at a time, and then a wider release, you kind of send it out to a bunch of different journalists at the same time. But of course, you can't offer an exclusive story at this point. But I use a similar personal email that I'll show you in a moment. But of course, yeah, removing the exclusive story side of it. And once I've emailed everybody on my list, I tend to send a slightly less personalized email to a slightly wider group of journalists to see if any of them picks them up. So it's probably not my most important journalists or outlets to reach, but I'll do it just to see if it kind of can give some extra awareness. Let's see, what was it more? Yeah, and then of course, you can also upload them to sites like my news desk, where journalists can come in and follow you and so on, and they will get a notification. But so far, I haven't had much success with it, probably because we're still pretty small. And then finally, the last step here is basically I'm also prepared for follow-up questions and interviews and so on. So in order to be prepared, I make my own Q&A. So I prepare answers for expected questions. I've memorized the numbers of data that we're talking about and repeated key messages, both with myself, but also in front of my teammates to make a good impression. And then here, I think this is almost the last slide. I just wanted to quickly show you how actually my personal short email looks like. And this is what I wrote the last time. So I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I start with a short intro to who I am, if they don't know me, and why I'm contacting them. And this is where I can show that why the story is relevant and why they should keep reading. And then I include a very short summary of the story. And this shouldn't take more than, half a minute to read or 200 words or so. And then finally add a quick note that if I can, I can offer this an exclusive. And then I also include a full press release as a PDF so they can read the full story, and a link to my press kit for more information. And this is really the moment to build relationships with the journalist, because hopefully he or she says yes. Most of the times they say no. But there can be a lot of reasons to why they do that. So ask them why and what could make it more interesting for them. In this case, with this release, can you tweak it somehow? Or for the next time you have a story, like what do they actually like to write about? And my final example, I pitched to the editor of Börsen Bæredygtig, but which I thought was super relevant, but it turned out that they actually usually write about slightly larger businesses than we are at the moment. So, which I only found out after asking her. And after a bit back and forth, she connected me with a colleague at Börsen, and we ended up getting a great article in Börsen instead. So great outcome there. And then finally, just for reference, the tools and tips that I'm using to stay organized. I mentioned most of them, I think. But I can mention a journalist newsletter is a great way to stay in touch. So you can send like short updates with a selected few important journalists about updates and news from your business. Just like most companies have a customer emails or investor newsletters, so you can do that with journalists. But yeah, I'm clocking in at 19 minutes. So thanks for listening, and yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Robin. That was really, really nice. So I think we're just going to jump right into the Q&A. We have about 10 minutes. So make sure that you ask your questions in the Q&A tab. I won't be checking it in the chat, so fire off in the Q&A section. Also, upvote your favorite questions so I know which one to prioritize. But let's just jump right into it. And Robin, I think we'll just stay with you for a little bit. I have a question here for you, specifically when you are a small team in a new startup with a lot of important work and tasks, how do you prioritize the time to do a thorough PR job?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I think it's about what I mentioned, like what's the strategic focus that you need to achieve right at this moment for the company overall, and how can PR help that? And one thing for us, like I mentioned, we need to grow our user base. So I know PR can do that if we do it well. So then I can motivate to write a consumer-facing release for that. And then we also noticed that when you're new and small and just starting up, it is hard to even get in contact with a lot of these big corporations or operators in our case. So getting our name out there in the news and so on really helps us to pitch us and show that we're legit and so on. So I basically just force myself to prioritize it because I can see the benefit that it's gonna give my company overall. So.
How are you structured in your team? Like, are you the only one doing PR, or how does that work?
Yeah, at the moment it's me because I have experience, and then I have one of my co-founders, Bibi, who's also very good at writing and so on. So she helps me, kind of as a sidekick when I have the story and so on. And luckily now we also have Alice at Pre-Seed, so she's been very kind to help us as well. But yeah, so it's just me at the moment, and I mean, then sometimes you have more time at your hand, and then you can focus more on it. So
okay,
yeah.
Cool.
So let's jump in on that. I just want to say it's a really good idea that the founder team and oftentimes the CEO do the PR in the beginning, because that's who the journalist is going to speak to and want to speak to. So building that relationship from the get-go is a really good idea. When you become an established company and have more credibility and validation, of course, journalists will be used to speaking to communications or press manager. But in the beginning, it's a really good idea to build the relation between the journalist and the CEO, if you can prioritize it. But that comes back to being very clear on if the strategic goal and the call to action of doing PR is important enough to prioritize the time. So only do it if you can see that purpose. Otherwise, it's free, but it's resource and time heavy. So spend it when you can see there's a clear strategic purpose for doing it.
All right, I have a related question here, also for you, Alice. There's a question here. Is it all investors that help with inspiration and sparring with the startups, or is that unique for pre-seed ventures?
Good question. It depends. Maybe Robin can also add something here. No, my experience is that different VCs have different sort of degrees of sparring on PR. Of course, some have a very small team and don't have the resources to do it at all. Some will more give you maybe a playbook or a few guides on what you can do. Some will only guide you in finding a good agency to work with, or say, work with these people, they know what they're doing. And some will be more hands-on like I am. So there are others who are hands-on, but I think in general, because we're working early on and coming back to the resource and time spent on PR, we try to be quite hands-on in our help, especially for the beginning. And then when you've done it once or twice, it's more like a sparring thing where I can be, I'm only a call away and I can say what I think or point you in the right direction, but I won't be as hands-on after you've done it. Okay. I think you should always do it yourself and have a guide to help you through it, rather than I do it completely, because then you won't be able to do it next time.
So just staying with you, there's a question here: how to stand out if you're solving the same problem differently as one of the startups that are doing really well on the PR? Any advice?
Good question. a PR question, because if you are in that situation that you don't really know where you stand out compared to others who are already taking the same position as you want to take, you have to look at your story, you have to look at your communication, you have to look at your brand and say, where do we stand out? Maybe you're doing the same thing, but then on a more value-driven side of things, or the way you create your story. Speaking of the role you take, the way you position yourself, you have to find out where you stand out, even if you're trying to accomplish the same thing. There will always be startups who's trying to do some of the same things as you do, or will come later and try to position. So that comes back to going into your brand positioning and saying, where do we stand out? And then letting that flow over to your PR strategy. I can highly recommend, there's a brand sprint workshop, which takes 3 hours. It's one of the Google startup teams who did it. There's a complete template. You can find it if you Google it, and we can also send it out. It's a very good, it's a really good tool, and it's 3 hours and it's super structured, and it will get you through some of the key points of finding out where you stand out.
Mm. Maybe you have some things, Robin, because I guess you are also in a field where there are competitors, right? And you've been also working where with other startups. So do you have any suggestions what to do if you are in this competitive field, and how to go about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically what Alice said, like, what's your story? But think about what's your unfair advantage, basically. So, I mean, for us, we could utilize the fact that we come from Momondo. So it's a well-known brand, and Martin, one of the co-founders, was part of funding it, right? So we can utilize that as a new startup to give trust and so on. And that helps us. Maybe for someone else, you had a successful exit before, or you always read this ex-Noma chef opens a new restaurant, right? That's what they're using, and that's their unfair advantage. So think about that. And I think everybody has some unique story in one way, but it actually took for me a long time to figure that out, that I really need to push the Momondo angle, because that's our unfair, and then we can craft stories around it and so on later. But yeah.
Yeah, so this actually also answers a little bit the question from Mass. He asks, do you actively try to frame stories towards either growth, funding, or similar, or do you try to do something all around? So you just pinpointed also that there are different angles here. You mentioned the Momondo, that you use that as a strategy.
Yeah.
So any other advice on pinpointing it on something?
Yeah, I mean, growth is great, but like I also said, I mean, they don't really care if you grow 100%, even though it's amazing, right? But how can you put that growth into perspective? So maybe, showing that the market is growing, or, during Corona, people, a sausage man somewhere stopped selling sausages. And I mean, you could tie it into something else, right? Into the news agenda to get it out there. But to really put it into perspective, I think is key. And then it can be growth or funding or different types of stories, right? But tie it into something that makes sense for the company, so it helps you grow, because we have limited resources, and that's time. So really be aware of that.
All right. So we'll just pick
it comes back to defining your call to action, your CTA of the PR. If all you need to do is, if you're a B2C app and you just need to grow your user base and get a lot of people into the app, then you have to think about, okay, what kind of stories is going to drive that? And then that's how you're going to shape your narrative. If you're going to hire 25 people and that's the thing that is going to matter in terms of doing the next product launch, then your stories need to be shaped around what will make people think it's an awesome place to work. So even if it's a funding story, then direct the funding story towards giving the message of one of those things. Be clear about why you're doing it.
Great. So we'll just pick up the last question for today. And Alice, this is for you from Mette. She asked, Alice, do you have an example of how to use the fairy tale model in creating your strategic story or PR? Do you use it to position your company as a helper, hero, object, or how would you actually use it?
It's a really good question. But yes, you can use it that way. I would say don't get too caught up in the specific roles. You can also sort of change them or define them yourself. But I think it's if you want to like really get into it. It's a really good mindset to have, to sort of take your stakeholders in a story, but also in your longer narrative that you're building, and say, okay, who is who here? Who is making what happen? And where do I want to be? Do I want to be the helper who is enabling someone? Do I want to make my customer the hero? Do I want to be the hero? It's a really good framework. Then you end up changing helper into challenger and hero into something else. But it's a good way of thinking to use those roles. And then, because then you can always go back to it and say, okay, are we taking the right role in this story, or are we actually going a bit away from the direction we're headed? Or are we putting someone else in a position where we maybe a stakeholder that you want to keep close, or with the public institutions in the story of radiobotics? Are we actually creating a wrong role for a public institution here that will push them away, or, you know? So I think it's a great mindset to have. Don't get too caught up in it, so you won't get ahead and just try out some things, but use it as a mindset. That's a great tool.
Great. Thank you, Alice. I think our time is up, but thank you very much for today, Alice and Robin. I will be uploading the recording and also the slides for you to go through in more detail. And Alice and I will also produce some of the content that we didn't get through in the middle section. So make sure to check that out. There's much more things to dive into. And then I just wish you a really great summer, and I hope to see you guys after the summer break. And we have a open door session in September, and the next Startup Talk is in August already. So have a really great summer, and I hope to see you guys after the summer break. Bye, Alice, and bye, Robin, and bye, everybody else.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.